As I mentioned, this is going to be our 38th and final lesson in 2 Samuel. We have spent 83 lessons in total in the book of Samuel combined, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now recall that originally what we have today as 4 separate Bible books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, was but one large work that became divided by Hebrew scholars originally into 2 books, and it happened in Alexandria, Egypt, before the birth of Christ. The first book was called the Book of Kingdoms, the second book, the Book of Kings. Kingdoms was later further divided into 1st and 2nd Samuel, Kings into 1st and 2nd Kings. This didn't harm anything. It was just an attempt to make an enormous work more readable, a lot more easy to deal with. So let's begin this evening by rereading 2 Samuel, chapter 24, the last chapter of 2 Samuel. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 364. 364. Follow along with me, please. The anger of Adonai blazed up against Israel, so he moved David to act against them by saying, "Go, take a census of Israel and Judah." The king said to Joab, the commander of the army who was with him, "Go systematically through all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and take a census of the population so that I can know how many people there are." And Joab said to the king, "May Adonai your God add to the people 100-fold, no matter how many they are, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king take pleasure in doing this?" However, the king's word prevailed against Joab and the army officers, so Joab and the army officers went out from the king's presence to take a census of the people of Israel. They crossed the Jordan, pitched camp in Aroer to the south of the city in the Wadi of Gad, and they went on to Yaser. They came to Gilead, and they continued to the land of Tachtim Hodshi. They arrived at Dan-an, went around to Zidon, and came to the stronghold of Zor. They went to the cities of the Hivites and the Canaanites and finished in the south of Judah at Beersheba. And when they were done going throughout all the land, they came back to Jerusalem. It had taken 9 months and 20 days. Joab reported the results of the census to the king. There were in Israel 800,000 valiant men who could handle a sword, while the men of Judah numbered 500,000. But after he had taken the census, David was conscience-stricken. David said to Adonai, "Oh, I have greatly sinned in what I have done. But now, Adonai, please, put aside your servant's sin, for I have done a very foolish thing." And when David got up in the morning, this word came to Adonai, a word from Adonai came to the prophet Gad, David's seer. "Go and say to David that this is what Adonai says. I'm giving you a choice of 3 punishments. Choose one of them. I will execute it against you." Gad came to David and told him. And he said, "Do you want 7 years of famine in your land, or do you want to flee before your enemies for 3 months while they pursue you, or do you want 3 days of plague in your land? Think about it. Tell me what to answer the one who sent me." David said to Gad, "This is very hard for me. Let us fall into the hand of Adonai, because his mercies are so great, rather than have me fall into the hand of man." So Adonai sent a plague on Israel from that morning until the end of the specified time. 70,000 of the people died between Dan and Beersheba. But when the angel stretched out his hand towards Jerusalem to destroy it, Adonai changed his mind about causing such distress and said to the angel destroying the people, "Enough, now withdraw your hand." The angel of Adonai was at the threshing floor of Aravnah the Yavusi, the Jebusite. And David spoke to Adonai when he saw the angel striking the people, and he said, "Here, I have sinned, I have done wrong, but these sheep, what have they done? Please, let your hand be against me, against my father's family." God came to David that day and said to him, "Go, set up an altar to Adonai on the threshing floor of Aravnah the Yavusi." David went up. He did what God said, and as Adonai had ordered. Aravnah looked out, and he saw the king and his servants coming towards him. Aravnah went out and prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground. Then Aravnah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" David said, "To buy your threshing floor, in order to build an altar to Adonai so that the plague will be lifted from the people." Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take and offer up anything that seems good to him. Here's the oxen for the burnt offering. You can use the threshing sledges, the yokes for the oxen as firewood. All this, O king, Araunah gives to the king." Then Araunah said to the king, "May Adonai your God accept you." But the king said to Araunah, "No, I insist on buying it from you at a price. I refuse to offer Adonai my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 1¼ pounds of silver shekels. Then David built an altar to Adonai there. He offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and after this, Adonai took pity on the land, and he lifted the plague from Israel. Now, last week we dealt with this difficult opening verse that in English seems to say that God told David to go and take a census of the people of Judah and of Israel. What we found was that God incited David towards thinking wrong thoughts. And the purpose was for this was as a means for the Lord to punish his people using his usual way. And that usual way is using a person or a nation to bring oppression upon Israel in consequence of Israel's sins. Now, these wrong thoughts in David produced his self-centered, his egotistical royal mandate that the army go around and conduct a census. Did God put that exact wrong thought into David's mind? Well, while reasonable people can differ on the answer to that question, my position is that he did not. Rather, the thought to conduct a census came to David's own evil inclination, David's Yetzer Hara, that every human, redeemed or not, Hebrew or Gentile, is born with, and we will live with until we're separated from these fleshly bodies at death. In fact, we noticed that in 1 Chronicles, which is a parallel story of this event, that the claim is that the adversary, Satan, put this thought of a census into David's mind. Now, such an idea fits well and it makes sense because the good inclination is the realm of godly thoughts, while the evil inclination is the realm of wicked thoughts. God does not dwell within our evil inclinations. Satan certainly does not dwell within our good inclinations. So it's self-evident that while Jehovah God incited David to consult his own evil inclination, it was the adversary who resided, if you would, in David's evil inclination, whose thought David agreed to. Now, this admittedly is a hard explanation of how the Lord and the adversary and David all had roles in this process. But it's hard because we are trying to use human words and human thoughts to explain spiritual circumstances. This reality has challenged Hebrews and Christians in all ages, and especially in the modern age, where humanism is all the rage, even with Judaism and within the church, such that we either elevate our ways or we lower his ways. We put God and man on approximately equal footing. And so when we forget this critical passage from the book of Isaiah, then we tend to get very confused or misled. In Isaiah 55, 8 and 9, it says this: "For my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways, says Adonai. As high as is the sky above the earth are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." So this is a good time to remind you that so much of the figurative speech about God that we read in chapters 22 and 23, that attributes human emotions and human thoughts as also being the same sorts of things in God, That's also present in this final chapter of 2 Samuel. We left off with David calling for his general of the army, Joab, and telling him to go around and conduct a census of all people under David's monarchy. And we found that the word translated into going around, or it can be translated as roaming or going to and fro. In Hebrew, the word is shut. And shut is a Hebrew word that's associated with wicked intent. So when David instructed Joab to shut and count the citizens of Israel, it was immediately clear that to do this was wrong, and it was going to have malignant effects. The worldly and politically adept Joab, general of the army, knows that what David is ordering is going to be highly unwelcome by the people of Israel, and so this could produce some dangerous unintended consequences. So in verse 2, we find David's rationale for ordering this census is, it is so that I can know how many people there are. In other words, it was merely because David could stop and assess just how big his kingdom had become. And just like for most any Christian or Jewish congregation leader, it seems that knowing how many people who are in their flock is important to them. Often there's a sound and a good reason to know this information, but as often as not, the seeking of this data has more to do with an egocentric notion of measuring institutional and personal success based on quantity. And in general, God's principle is that there is but a small handful of specific divine reasons for a leader needing to know and paying attention to quantity, particularly as it concerns people. And what else is a census but the name of a procedure to ascertain the quantity of people? My point is, there was nothing particularly pressing or essential that David needed to know such that he needed an accurate accounting of his subjects. This was all based on personal aggrandizement. And to a large extent, even the rabbis, who try at all costs to protect David's image, agree with this. Joab knew this. So he openly challenged the king of Israel's motivation for this dangerous decree. And in verse 3, Joab essentially says, and I paraphrase, look, I hope along with you that since we've arrived in Canaan that our population has increased 100 times over. We all know our population is large and it's growing, but does it really matter that we know the precise number? So what is it about doing the census that you're hoping is going to give you personal pleasure? That last question is kind of rhetorical. Joab fully understands that unless there is some underlying reason or some grand plan that Joab isn't aware of, and that's pretty unlikely, then he is baffled why David would undertake such an enormous and such an unpopular program as taking a census. But the aged David, who's on the downside of both his career as king and his relationship with God, he just dismisses Joab's objections. And in verse 4, the army then sets about to dutifully, however reluctantly, follow the king's order to count the people of Israel and Judah. Well, the obvious point, or rather question at this point is, so what's so wrong about a census? I mean, in order to get that answer, we have to attack this issue on both an earthly human and spiritual divine level. At this point in chapter 24, the issue is earthly human. From a political viewpoint, a census would have made the people very uneasy and suspicious. After David's series of indiscretions now, especially with Bathsheba, his obvious attitude that he was at all times above the law, and then 2 rebellions that demonstrated the dissatisfaction and mistrust of the government among substantial segments of Israeli society, conducting a sentence couldn't be more ill-timed. Setting aside a king's self-centered desire simply to enjoy the extent of his empire, kind of like we get this mental picture of Midas laying upon his enormous mountainous pile of golden coins and lavishing in his riches. There were the typical practical governmental reasons for counting people, none of which did the people particularly care for. And the 2 primary reasons were for taxation and for conscription into the army. And up to now, it doesn't appear that there was a nationwide formal system of taxation under David. However, without doubt, there had to be some means of revenue. That was soon going to change when his son Solomon took over. So on one hand, the primary fear for the average citizen would have been conscription into the army. Now, we shouldn't forget that David maintained only a rather small personal bodyguard and a very modest-sized professional army that consisted mostly of leaders and officers. When war was contemplated, an army was formed as a militia from among the civilian citizenry. Farmers, herders, and craftsmen would then lay aside their tending of flocks and herds and fields and making goods in exchange for taking up arms. Such a thing was quite a sacrifice on the people of Israel, because when the adult males were away at war, the burden of supporting their families then fell to the women. So when Joab and his officers went throughout the nation to count the people, the immediate suspicion was, uh-oh, war is coming. And just like it is today in the USA, people come down strongly on both sides of the issue of military conflict. Such a thing can cause great division within any society. David seemed just unconcerned about those prospects, while Joab knew that whether David did harbor a secret plan for a foreign war of conquest, or the census itself caused eruption into civil unrest, Joab and his men were going to wind up right in the middle of it. But there is also now the spiritual, divine side of this matter, of taking a census. For Israel, a census was supposed to be taken only for godly purposes. And as an example, one is for the purpose of redemption. Listen to Exodus 30, 11 through 16. Adonai said to Moses, when you take a census of the people of Israel and register them, each, upon registration, is to pay a ransom for his life to Adonai to avoid any breakout of plague among them during the time of the census. Everyone subject to the census is to pay as an offering to Adonai half a shekel by the standard of the sanctuary shekel. Everyone over 20 years of age who is subject to the census is to give this offering to Adonai. The rich is not to give more, or the poor less, than the half shekel when giving Adonai's offering to atone for your lives. You are to take the atonement money from the people of Israel and use it for the service in the tent of meeting, so that it will be a reminder to the people of Israel before Adonai to atone for your lives. A later God-ordained census in Numbers starts off like this, and it was for the purpose of holy war. In Numbers 1:1 we read, Adonai spoke to Moses in the Sinai desert in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month of the second year after they'd left the land of Egypt. And he said, take a census of the entire assembly of the people of Israel by clans and by families, and record the names of all the men 20 years old and over who are subject to military service to Israel. You and Aaron are to enumerate them company by company. So what we see from this as a God principle is that a census must be God ordained and for a purpose that is in line with God's will and with his Torah. Secondly, that the Exodus passage seems to indicate that the divinely prescribed penalty for doing a census outside of God's protocol instructions is a plague. And of course, that's exactly what we see happen as a result of David's census. In verse 5, the army, led by Joab, sets off to compass the land and make the count. The territory that is listed in this passage essentially covers the land that was currently under control of David's monarchy in Jerusalem. And while there is evidence that the exact route as listed might be missing a few parts, the general route of it comports pretty well with other texts and what's known from that era. He starts off at Aroer, that's located on the established boundary between the tribe of Gad and the nation of Moab. They went north through the territory of Gad, traveling up the middle of the tribal district. From there, they arrived at Yazer, which was an Israelite border fortification established to defend against the kingdom of Ammon, that's the kingdom of Jordan in our time. They continued north through Gilead to a place that's called Tachtim Hodshi. There is a scholarly disagreement as to what the true name of this place is. Rashi says that Hodshi means new, so it's a place that's really called New Tachtim. Now, likely this is not so much a formal name, it's just a way to say this is just a newly settled area. Anyway, the Greek Septuagint takes the approach that this is referring to some place in a large territory of Bashan. Probably both Rashi and the Septuagint are correct. Anyway, from there, Joab bends to the northwest to a place in the territory of Dan called Ya'an that was located at the foot of Mount Hermon. This would mark now the northernmost boundary of Israel for that time. Recall that Dan had moved there many years earlier from the area they had originally been assigned by Moses and Joshua. Their original territory was located on the western side of central Canaan. They migrated north because they couldn't overcome the Philistines. After that, the census team traveled across what today is called the Upper Galilee, along the border with Sidon, onto the fortress city of Zor. From there, it starts to get pretty hazy. There is a strange reference to the cities of the Hivites and Canaanites that has frustrated historians because not a single specific city is listed. No matter the route, it makes clear that these cities are all in the northern part of the Promised Land. But it seems logical that this is referring to the conditions that are discussed way back in Judges 1:27 through 35, where there is a list of towns that had been left unconquered in various districts that had been assigned to these 12 Israelite tribes. This also seems to answer the mystery of whatever became of those Canaanite and Hivite cities in this list, and explains that while for perhaps 2 centuries or so these cities had remained independent from Israel, but more or less on friendly terms with Israel rather, that by David's day they had assimilated socially and politically into the kingdom of Israel. So there was undoubtedly a great deal of intermarriage between these Canaanites and Hebrews, borrowing one another's customs and adopting elements of one another's worship practices and so respecting one another's gods. And while it has all the nice sounding aspects of various people coming together in peace and love and harmony and multicultural understanding, the reality is that Israel's worship of God became greatly corrupted. And it would eventually result and God expelling the northern kingdom from their land as a consequence. Well, verse 6 explains that the census workers ended in Judah at Beersheba, which is the traditional southernmost city of the kingdom of Judah, therefore kind of the lower end of the territory controlled by the unified monarchy under King David. Then we're told it took 9 months and 20 days to accomplish the census. Now, it's rare that the Bible is ever so specific about time. So you kind of have to wonder if there's something underlying the reason for giving us this precise information. The ancient Hebrew sages point out that the correlation we probably ought to see is that this is the same amount of time of normal human gestation. Remembering that a lunar month is a bit shorter than a modern day calendar month on average, we wind up with a time frame in this of 294 days or 42 weeks. Although the number quoted regularly in modern times is 40 weeks of pregnancy for a human female, that's really just the average pregnancy period since the beginning of the modern industrial age. Medically speaking, the historical period for maximum nominal human gestation is said to be 42 weeks, exactly the same amount of time as the census was said to have taken. So the idea can only be that the evil that was conceived in David's mind and gestated until it gave birth to this catastrophe is likened to the conception of a child that gestates until it breaks out of the womb and into the world. We, of course, find this similar birthing metaphor used in describing Christians as being what? Reborn. Born again. And then of the coming end times days of the Lord, it's equated to a woman who is at first in the pains of labor that signals the beginning of the final stage of a process that's unstoppable. It's inevitable. Well, the results of this census are reported as 800,000 in Israel and 500,000 in Judah, for a combined total of 1.3 million. However, the number is not the total population of Israel. It's only of the men of military age. That's generally around 17 to 50 years of age. So a conservative multiplier of 5 to account for males under 17 and over 50, those who are in some way not suitable for military service, plus all the females from infant to elderly, slave to free, married, widowed, singled, ill or well. This tells us that Israel was probably a nation of around 6.5 million souls, or something well over double of that which had entered Israel under Joshua. Nevertheless, this figure is quite at odds with the parallel account of this census in 1 Chronicles 21. There the totals are 1.1 million in Israel and 470,000 for Judah, giving us 1.57 million males of military age. Even more, the Chronicles account tells us that Joab, even in that, did not count Levites or people from the tribe of Benjamin. So if this is the more correct number, then Israel's population was probably well over 8 million people at this time. It is rather easy to understand why Levi wasn't counted, because long ago they were separated away from Israel by Jehovah, and they were no longer to be counted among their brethren. This happened when the priesthood was established. And of course, the Levites were also exempt from military service as an automatic result of not being part of Israel any longer. But why wasn't Benjamin counted? Well, since the scriptures don't tell us, anything at all would just be speculation. It could be as simple as what is mentioned about Benjamin in 1 Chronicles 21. In verse 6 it says, "But he didn't count Levi and Benjamin among them because the king's order was hateful to Joab." So he made that decision. Joab at some point just stopped counting because he was so upset with this whole concept of a census, he just apparently stopped before he got to Benjamin. So very likely, even though some behind-the-scenes politicking occurred in this regard, it essentially amounts to Joab just not wanting to count Benjamin. So he didn't. Thus, some rabbis say that the 1.1 million figure for Israel is taken from another tradition, whereby David sent someone not so reluctant to count Benjamin after the census was completed, and the 1.1 million number includes Benjamin and maybe even Levi. I don't find that very credible, because it's unimaginable that Benjamin had regenerated so sufficiently, since they had nearly been made extinct due to the slaughter of the Benjamite men that resulted from that incident of the concubine at Gibeah. And while in some ways I can imagine David ignoring the commandment not to count Levi, I can't imagine the Levite being population being so large as to add 300,000 to the census number. So the bottom line is, I just don't know why this discrepancy exists, and neither does anybody else. It could be, and likely is, a copyist error in either 2 Samuel or 1 Chronicles, but we have no way of knowing. Well, now that this census is over, David suddenly realizes what he's done, and he confesses his sin to the Lord. So typical of David, the man after God's own heart, he has run exceptionally cold by doing what was wrong. Now he runs exceptionally hot by admitting his trespass. He repents without excuse. Most English translations say that David's heart, his leb, struck him. And this is quite literally what it says in the original Hebrew. The problem is that in the biblical days, the heart was seen as the center of intellect and morality, not emotion. So because modern Western believers think of the brain as our seat of intellect and morality, the heart as the seat of emotion, we assume that David was feeling exceptional guilt. But that would be the wrong idea. The idea is better expressed in the complete Jewish Bible, where it says David's conscience, his moral intellect, realized on a conscious level he had done a foolish and a wrong thing. Well, the foolishness of his actions was validated when the next morning the prophet Gad shows up in front of David with a message directly from the Lord. And since David has already admitted his guilt to the great cosmic judge, there's no point of a trial. So the matter goes directly to the penalty phase. And in an unexpected and unprecedented action, the Lord allows David to choose his punishment from among three options. And on the surface, it seems as though he was playing the heavenly version of a popular game show. Behind door number 1 was a 7-year famine. Behind door number 2 was that David would flee from his enemies for 3 months. And behind door number 3, there's a plague upon the entire land. Why such a strange procedure? Probably this was a test of some sort to see if David would choose as wisely in accordance with the Torah commandments as he previously chose unwisely and unlawfully ordering a census. David says, these are all terrible choices. So you know what? I'm going to give the choice back to God, and I'll just suffer whatever the Lord chooses. Besides, says David, the Lord's merciful, and he's hoping for mercy. Well, it shouldn't surprise us that the great lawgiver would choose to place upon David exactly the Torah prescribed penalty pronounced back in Exodus 30. An improper census brings a plague. And immediately it starts. And 70,000 Israelites die in a matter of hours. And it affects every corner of the land, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. But when the plague was about to devastate Jerusalem, Jehovah God stopped it. Now, a couple of points. First of all, the term used for the 70,000 people who died was Am. And Am refers to God's people and no one else. Thus, the only people who died was the redeemed Israelites, not any of the foreigners or pagans who still lived in the land. It's interesting, really, that God's laws and commands in one sense apply only to God's worshipers. That is, the Torah isn't for pagans. So, in general, they're not held to account for violating it. And this is because since they're not God's people, they're already condemned. Further, to be a non-believer and to obey God's commandments in some mechanical way in hopes of obtaining a benefit is just a fruitless effort. Only those who trust the Lord have any obligation to follow his commands. And only those who trust and obey benefit from that obedience. Here we once again run into this troublesome term, the angel of the Lord. Malach Yehovah, angel of the Lord. Usually the angel of the Lord is the Lord himself. And I know this because we see him speaking in the first person. I, me. But here we have Jehovah giving orders to this angel of the Lord. No doubt, this time, the point of the term is to make it clear that this is not a human messenger like a prophet who has his hand outstretched over Jerusalem. Rather, it is a heavenly messenger. It's an angel sent by God. And the angel is sent to be a destroyer. But the Lord refuses to allow Jerusalem to be touched because he has elected it to be the home to his temple. So in his divine mercy, God limits the duration of the plague before it can run its full course. Well, it's now clear from this story that the Lord used David's sin, emanating from his own evil inclination, as a vehicle to exact punishment on the people of Israel for their sins. The plague that is a result of David's sin of ordering a census is used to punish the Am of Israel for their whatever the unnamed sin is. Now, most Bible translations will say in verse 16 something to the effect that the Lord repented of his evil and didn't destroy the people of Jerusalem. The complete Jewish Bible far better captures the sense by saying Adonai changed his mind about causing distress. The Hebrew word ra means evil in the sense of wicked, but also it means calamity, disaster, since in the ancient world all calamity was seen as supernaturally caused. Now the New Testament offers a very interesting parallel to this action of God in the book of Mark. So if you want to follow along with me, turn to Mark 13, and we're going to read verses 14 through 20. This will sound familiar to you. Mark 13, we'll be starting on page 1281 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. Mark 13, starting at verse 14. Now, when you see the abomination that causes devastation standing where it ought not to be, let the reader understand this allusion, that will be the time for those in Judah to escape to the hills. If someone is on the roof, he must not go down and enter his house to take any of his belongings. If someone is in the field, he must not turn back to get his coat. What a terrible time it will be for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that it may not happen in winter. For there will be worse trouble at that time than there has ever been from the very beginning when God created the universe until now. And there will be nothing like it again. Indeed, if God had not limited the duration of the trouble, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those whom he has chosen, he has limited it. Here we see that as Yeshua is standing in Jerusalem, speaking about what's going to be happening in Jerusalem at some time in the future, he speaks of God stopping a horrific but a divinely ordained calamity. Why does he stop it? For the sake of his elect. And doing so, we're told, before the duration of the calamity was initially appointed to finish. He stopped it short. This is very much after the pattern we just read in 2 Samuel chapter 24. Now, the remainder of this chapter explains how the site for the temple of God was chosen. And it was that the very spot where that destroying angel stood upon Araunah's threshing floor, that was where the Temple Mount would be built. It is a wonderful reality and prophetic symbolism. The temple would be where atonement could be made for God's people, and thus God's wrath upon them would be stayed. The temple would be located at the same place that Abraham took his son Isaac and bound him and was about to offer him up as a sacrifice when God stopped him. The temple is the place where the supernatural punishment that people were due for their trespasses could be ordered by the Father to cease. It is important to notice that the Jebusites were the original builders and inhabitants of the city of David. So, Araunah, the landowner, who David bought this land from for the temple, the original owner of that land, was a Gentile. And when the prophet Gad came to David and told him to set up an altar to Jehovah God on that place, David personally went to Araunah and asked to buy the land from him. Araunah was shocked that David came to him rather than just summoning him to the king's palace. And when David asked to buy the land in order to build an altar, the Jebusite responded by offering to give David the oxen for the sacrifice, as well as the wooden threshing sled and the oxen yoke for an altar fire. And in fact, those animals were used as the sacrifice. But notice that he did not offer to donate the land to David. David then proposed a price. Araunah accepted it. Now the stage was set for the building of God's house on earth. It is fascinating that just as the conditions for the construction for the first temple on Mount Moriah was a cooperative venture between Jew and Gentile, so it's going to be for the last temple. In Zechariah 6:15, those who are now far away will come and help rebuild the temple of Adonai. Then you will know that it is Adonai Zevaot who sent me to you. And it will come about, provided you heed carefully what Adonai your God says. David built the altar. He offered the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, and the plague stopped. Just like that. That ends our study of 2 Samuel. Next week, we'll take up the book of Kings. Please rise.
Yeshua.